Okay, welcome. This is John Pyle. I wanted to run through a quick tutorial on how to use the animation state machine, the animation controller, the animator within Unity, because this is something that I find a lot of people are hesitant to jump into, use, but is quite a easy to use tool when you know what you're doing. What we're looking now at right now is what we're going to set up by the end of this video. It's a little bit long, and there's a lot of little pieces and parts that I need to mention. But I think if you watch through this all once, you'll see that it's actually not that complicated, quite easy to use, and as long as everything's set up correctly, both in your Maya files and then you come over here on the Unity side and get everything set up. Once you've got it set up, and at least that first time, adding to the system is really quite easy, and it allows a lot of fine control to your artists and animators to make your transitions between various animation states look really good. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that your FBX files that you brought from your animation tool, your 3D modeling tool like Maya, are created correctly. So the first thing you want to make sure is that you have a model that is just the 3D model by itself. The animations are going to be exported separately, and they've got to be named with the same name as the 3D model, so that Unity can find the and match the animations to the models. So you'll notice here in this case, I've got the model is robot.fbx, and each of the animations are robot at and then the name of the animation. And I've actually already imported these, so I've got the meta file information as well. But these are going to be again created in something like Maya and then imported into Unity. So once they're in Unity, we're going to see them here in my, I've got robot art files. I've got my materials folder, which comes along with that, the import process. And looking at my robot itself, the model, we can see the model is here. And what we want to do is make sure when you selected rig that the animation type is generic. If it's none or legacy, the animation controller won't like it. It's going to be generic or humanoid if you actually have a humanoid character. As far as the avatar definition, it's important that for the model, this is create from this model. And then what's going to happen is when we select the individual animations over here, you're going to notice that they're going to be copy from other avatar. The avatar is automatically generated over here, robot avatar, which comes from the 3D model. And then if we copy from avatar, we'll immediately see that in my sources here, I can select robot avatar that it finds inside the model. So everything has been set up here correctly. You'll notice in the robot there are no animations to import, and in these animations themselves, the animations have been imported. So it's important to set this up correctly. The other thing you're going to want to make sure you do is that when you generate your animations in Maya, you name the individual takes something other than the generic take 001, because it's going to be necessary for you to find these takes later on, and Unity will pull that take name directly from Maya. And I've seen a lot of artists who by default will just go ahead and leave the default name in there, and then once they're over in Unity, they don't realize that that's actually an important piece that the Unity system is going to need to know and be able to hook up. And we'll look at that here in a moment. Okay, now that you have your 3D model and your animations ready to go, in this case we've got an idle animation, a walk animation, and a forward attack animation. Once they're ready to go, you've imported them correctly, you can just go ahead and take that 3D model and drag it directly into your scene to create a game object that you'll notice a Animator. And again, some of these names are going to be sort of confusing at first. We've got animations, your animator, and your animation controller, or animator controller. And you'll notice that the controller on the animator is currently empty, but it does find the robot avatar right away. But we'll go ahead and once we've got that, I actually want to create a new folder. I'm going to call it my robot prefab folder because I'm going to then generate a robot prefab by dragging it in there so I can use it later. I also need to remember that this particular model, I need the rotation to be 90, and so I'm going to go over here and make sure that that's been applied so that later on I've got access to that. Let me go ahead and save that, and we'll have that good for later. Once you've got your robot in place, again, now we need a animation controller. So I'm going to, in my prefab here, I'm going to create a animation controller and call that robot anim controller. And then over here, I will then be able to select in my assets my robot animation controller, or animation controller, which is currently empty. So now I need to go ahead and double click on that controller, and we'll be able to edit the controller here. I don't really like the way this sets up these states because they're kind of, especially in this resolution, kind of hard to see. But you've got 3 states by default: any state, entry state, and exit state. And what this really does is it gives you a sort of graphical state machine that's going to allow you to create individual states and then associate individual animation takes with each one of these states. And so just as an example, to get this started, I'm going to create a new state. This is going to be an empty state. I'm going to call it my idle state. And then I'm going to grab a motion, which is another word for takes. And in here, I can see that I've got a variety of takes that I can select from. And I'm going to select that robot walk state, or the stand, which is my idle state. So I'm going to do there. And once I've done that, then you can see with this setup here and these states set up, if I go over to the game view and I play this, I'll take a moment here. You can see it immediately switches over and runs the idle pose for that animation, which is really handy, and that's sort of step one to getting your animation to play in game. Is again, you've got a 3D model, you've got a set of art files here. There's my robot, and here's the stand animation. So if I wanted to say, for example, change that to my walk animation, I can look here. Let's go ahead and pause this or stop that. Look at my animation controller, which is open in this window, and set my idle state and change it to something else. So let's go and select this a different way just to see if we can do that. So there's my walk animation. Select this, select that there, and then drag this into there, and I can do that way also. So now my entry state immediately goes to my idle state. My idle state is my walk state, or my walk motion, and then if I go over here and I play the animation, we can see that it goes through the walk. You'll notice it just did that a single time. So if I wanted to actually go in here and have a if I wanted that to loop, there's 2 ways I can go about having that loop. I can, like I did in my, set up here in my stand animation, go here and look at animations, and it should say, let's see, that it has a loop time, and that's coming directly from what was set up by my artist in Maya. And you'll notice that the robot walk doesn't have a loop time. If I wanted to add one there, I could, and then when I play it here, I have to apply that change. Now I'm looping here, which may or may not be something I want to do. There's another way to go about that. So let me go ahead and click uncheck that, apply that. Now I'm back to the same state I was before. But now what I can do is, and let's go ahead and just watch that just to make sure we see it. It goes through once and then it's done. But in my state, let's say I wanted to create a transition in my state, make a transition, and I'm going to make it back to myself. I can make it to the exit, I can make it to the entry, I can make it to any state. I'm going to make it back to idle. And so that means that it's going from an entry state to an idle state. And when it gets done with its idle state, it's going to go back to the idle state. So just as a basic state transition back onto itself, I could do that. And then if I play it, I get this loop in here. Now you can see that's not a very nice transition. You can it's not going to be nearly as smooth as what's going to come from the Maya file because you're sort of every frame checking to see if I need to change my state. We're kind of skipping a state change there. So that's not necessarily the best way to go about creating your looping pose. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on that transition. And I'm going to look at some of my settings here, and you can see what's happening is I was actually, yeah, I guess it wasn't correct to say that it was because of what it was checking. It's because there's actually a transition from my idle to my idle, which is why we were getting that weird behavior. So if you look here, you can see that happening in the preview, and it's this overlapping going from idle to idle that has some default of about you know, 1/10 of a second in here, and so if I then drop this down to be no idle time, and actually the easier way to do this is set my settings here exactly no offset at all, and I make this 1.0 because that's what it's set at. Now if I run this thing, it looks a little better. Okay, so now that I have sort of this example of going back to the idle state, that's really not a great way to do looping. So I am not going to do that here in this case. I'm going to go ahead and remove that transition. And of course, a better way to do this is go back to your artist and ask them to make sure that the FBX is set to loop automatically. But again, I'm going to create my loop time there, apply that. And so now I have a looping walk animation, but we don't want that to be in the state here. We actually want this to be our stand state, or our stand motion in the idle state. And I want to create a new state, and that's going to be my walk. And now I can drag this over here, and I'm going to right click and make a transition to my walk animation, and my walk animation needs a motion. That is going to be walk. And so now what's going to happen is I'm going to go from the entry state to the idle state, and then from the idle state to the walk state due to this transition here. And if you click on this transition again, this is how you can see what are the conditions for that transition, and you know what's going to make that switch, and how is it going to transition from, in this case, an idle state to a walk state. So we can preview that here. So makes that transition into the walk state. We can stop the preview and we can scrub it. And you can actually get in close here and you can rotate around to see, make sure that transitions the way I want it to. And if you don't like the way it transitions, you can either make it transition faster, something like this, or not. So, and the reason this works is because this particular transition has an exit time. So what it says is when you get to the end of this idle state, it's going to go ahead and make the transition. If I didn't have an exit time, I can uncheck that. It's going to wait for another condition, something perhaps programmatically, to come through and tell it when it needs to make that transition. And you can see there are no conditions here. So there's, right now, although this transition exists in the game, if I run this, there's nothing that is going to happen. Even though it gets to the end of the idle animation, it's going ahead and looping like it should, like it's set to, because there's no condition set for it to move from one state to the other. Okay, I have my animator, and I went ahead and deleted that transition just because I want to do it again from the start. So I'm going to right click, make a transition to the walk. We can see immediately, once I have this selected, that the transitions that are available are listed there. I can click on the arrow here to show me that transition. Again, we want to remove this has exit time. And we can see that the conditions, now that I've removed that, there are no conditions listed for any reason for it to go from the idle to the walk state within the Animator state machine. So I need to give it a reason. So I've added a parameter. Let me go ahead and delete that and start from scratch. I'm going to click plus Boolean and say is walking. And so there's my parameter set up. And here is the transition. And I'm going to add a condition, which is if is walking is true, then it should make that transition from idle to walk. However, there's one weird thing about this, and let me go ahead and I set this up, and I want to be able to see both of these side by side. So let me click that there and set up my view here. Okay, so now I can see my state machine, I can see the game view, I can see that he's idling. I've got this condition set up to ensure that if is walking is true, then it's going to transition from the idle state to the walk state. And I click that, and that should immediately cause a transition, but it doesn't. It's a little bug in this particular version of Unity I have. I need to go in here and change this to false, and then change it back to true. It sort of resets it and gets it to pay attention. And then from then on, whenever I click is walking, it's immediately going to do that transition to the walk cycle. And but if I uncheck this, it stays in the walk cycle, and that's because there's no reason, I've got no transitions to move it back to the idle cycle. So I'm going to unplay here. I'm going to right click, make transition to idle, click on that transition, and say if is walking is false, then it will make the transition back to the idle state. So we've got a transition coming from the entry state to the idle state, from idle to walking when is walking is true, from walk to idle when is walking is false. And the other thing I might not have mentioned here is the default is to be on this layers tab, but we want to select the parameters tab, and then we have the access to this create new parameters. They can be float. That's great for if you want to set up like actual something that's based on how far maybe the users press their controller to the left or right. If it's greater than 0.5, then you make a transition. But in this case, it's going to be just a Boolean that's easy to control. And if I play this, we'll see that I can click is walking, and it makes that transition immediately. And then I switch back, and it transitions back. So one of the things we want to do, though, is we want to make sure that we've set everything correct here. So let's look back at this transition. And we still have that exit time. I want to get rid of that because that sort of defaults in. So I don't want there to be, I don't want it to wait until the end of the walk cycle to exit. I want it to exit immediately. And then this transition is really important. Let me set this here and show you what it looks like if, let me just zero these out here, if there is no transition time. So now I'm going to go ahead and play that. We switch to the is walking. Now watch what happens. Watch him when I uncheck this. He immediately stops. That's not very nice. So we want to go ahead and make sure that this transition is a nice, nice long transition. Something that we will actually be able to detect. We can preview that transition there. We can scrub across it. Let's say we want it to be a nice longer transition from walk to stop. Slows down. Or we can make it a little faster of a transition. We can decide how that happens. I like it where it's set here. So let's go ahead and just test that out again. And it stops. So now let's go ahead and play that. You can see he's in the idle state. He's idling. Click that. Is walking to be true. It's in walking. Uncheck it. And that was a nice stop. Again, so the artist didn't have to animate a transition from idle to walk. It was just able to create that idle transition and then create, or sorry, that idle pose, and create a walk pose, or create an idle animation and create a walk animation, and then Unity deals with a transition between them, which is really quite slick of a setup. And again, you have a lot of control over how those are controlled. So what you want to do is you want to make sure your animator is in Unity and getting familiar with these tools, because this is a very artistic, and it's all about being aesthetically pleasing. Your designer might have some say about how fast that stop happens, or how quickly you transition from one state to another. But generally, this is something that where I've worked in the past, the programmer does the initial setup, gets the artist familiar with the setup, and then from there, the artist can take over. So the next step for this is you really want to make sure that you don't want to actually have a checkbox to make that happen. You want to have that happen programmatically. So I have got a little script that I created here, and let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. And so this is a basic, I call it the robot locomotion script. This is C# code. I've got an animator that I need to get a hold of at the beginning of the game. So when this starts up, it's going to grab the animator component, so I don't have to do this get component every frame. Place it in this m_animator value, and then we're going to on the update, we've got a variable called isWalkingPressed. It's going to look to see if the space key has been pressed, and if so, it's going to be true, which is then going to set this parameter isWalking to true in the animator. So this is a quick way to just say that if I press space, it's walking, and if I let go of space, then this is going to be false. Again, the word isWalking has to match over here on our whatever our parameter is named here. So there has to be a text match between those two. So now that I've got this script, I'm going to make sure this is saved. It is saved. So now I can go over here on my robot. Actually, let's do it on the prefab, because I want to apply it to all the instances of the robot. I might have multiple ones. Add component. My robot locomotion script is there. So I can just go to my locomotion script, click it. Now that this is attached at the same level as the animator, we can see that because this was grabbed from a prefab, it's also on my actual instance of it. And if I play it, and this is untested, so let's make sure this works. And now I'm going to press space, and I'm holding down space, and it's this walk cycle, and I'll let go space, and it switches back to idle. So we immediately have, through this state machine and real simple code, this really cool, nice transition system, again, state machine based system that allows us to control from user input what's happening in the animation. It's one of the most powerful tools that Unity has included, that I find that most folks are either sort of intimidated by, or they got so familiar with the legacy animation system that they don't want to jump in and try this. But this is a really, really slick system that they've set up here, and provides a lot of power, and just requires some back and forth between the programmers and the artists and the designers to get set up. And then once it's set up, we have got a lot of control available to make those transitions. So I'm going to go ahead and pause here for a moment and set up a little more complicated state machine to show you sort of the other ideas that you might be able to set up in this kind of setting. Okay, so I set up a scene here, and just as an example of something a little more complicated, we still have the idle and the walk states, but now I've got a new state called the attack state. Given it a name there, I've added the robot combat forward attack 01 far, which was the name of the take from my artist. So the motion is in there, and then I created two state transitions, one coming from walk because I want to be able to punch while you're walking, and that checks the condition has punched, and if that's true, then it transitions to attack. And equally over here on idle, I need to add the state that If it's idle and it has punched, then it needs to switch to true. And that's true, then it needs to switch to the attack state. So now I've got two input states, and then run the attack, that motion, and then the exit state is no condition because I actually want the full attack to run. So watch this here. So run the attack, and then it immediately should go back to the idle state based on an exit time. So at the end of the attack, right there, at the end of that, I want it to immediately go back to idle. And then if the user is pressing down, then it will transition from idle back to walk. So that's why I have this has exit time set and no conditions. So if we have that set up here and I were to play that, I've actually got to show you, I guess, the code as well. So on the code side, I still have the same setup here, but I changed this to get key is right pressed, and that's going to be is walking pressed, and then has punched pressed is going to be get key down because I don't want to do that every frame. I want the user to have to do that multiple times. So every time the key spacebar has been pressed down, we're going to change that to has punched to be true. So I've got that. That's the same script. It's already on my robot. So now if I run this and we look at the system here, I'm going to press the right arrow. It's going to start walking, and then I press space. And this whole time I've got the right arrow held down, or I can let go of the right arrow and press space, and I get my transition there. Let's look at on the animation side. I actually have to have this sitting beside here for us to be able to see that. So here's the game view and the setup over here. Click on here so we can actually watch this. I'm going to press space, space, space. You can see it making that transition to the attack. And then if I'm over here and I press right arrow, you can see it's over here. And then if I press space, and you can see that it goes back to idle and then walk because I'm not letting go of the right arrow key. If I can space, it's pretty fun. And obviously you can see what's happening here. You see that brief flash of a has punched and then the right arrow. Okay, so enough of that. The last thing I want to show you is that in this case, and let me switch this back to here so we can see it full screen. Okay, so what we tend to think of this is that your idle and your walk are your locomotion states, and your attack states or your combat states are separate. So I might have punch, I might have kick, I might have multiple types of punch. So in those cases, I could just make a really big, a big spider web of transitions between states. I'm going to have to create all those transitions anyways, but I can add a little bit of organization by coming in here to create a substate machine. So if I create a substate machine, and let's call this combat, I can then have multiple combat states in here, and I can double click on that, and I can create maybe an empty state, and then create another empty state. We'll call this combat 01. Of course, you're going to give it a better name. I'm going to call this combat 02. I can make a transition between this one to this one, but then what happens, actually I probably don't want to do that. Go ahead and delete that transition. But for example, I might want to go back to the base layer and say, from the walk, I want to make a transition to this substate machine, and it's going to tell me which states are in there to combat, and then I'm in another state transition to combat 02. So now this line shows you that there's multiple transitions with those three arrows. You can see in here that from the base layer, there are two different transitions coming into combat. And then I want to do the same thing. I want to have transitions back to the base state, back to idle. Here, make a transition back to the base state to idle. And then we can see that I've got, it immediately puts a sort of from walk to my combat is the ones I just added earlier, and then combat to idle are the ones I just added a moment ago. And so then I've got the ability to have, I could have all of my idle and walk in a locomotion substate machine, all of my attacks in a combat substate machine, and then I'll have a little bit more clarity to be able to see what's happening when I'm working on these on an individual basis. But I don't want that right now. I'm going to go ahead and delete that to get rid of it. There's so much more that can be done inside this animation system. One of the things that you might want to do is might want to create a blend tree. Those are very cool. That allows you to blend between animations instead of transitioning from one animation to another. You want to blend between two of the same animations or multiple animations. We did some really cool stuff with this robot to be able to detect sort of radially where the attack was being directed, and then I had a animation for up, down, right, and left for attacking, and then I could blend between those animations based on where the user was pressing, what direction the user was pressing. There's also the ability to create layers, and those are useful. I don't use them as much. But another thing you can do, which is quite cool, is in the animations themselves. Sorry, am I clicking the wrong one here? In the animations themselves, you can create masks, and this will allow you to use your bones to create masks. So let's say in this case, you might want a attack happening on the upper portion of the body that is the same every time. That's maybe animated in Maya as a separate animation, and that to be played against either a walk or idle for the lower half of the segments. It's a lot more complicated. You really got to know what you're doing to set those up. Both your animator as well as your coder need to kind of work together to that. I say complicated. It's not that complicated, but it's too complicated for this intro talk. I hope this helped. Again, this is a really powerful system. Probably said that way too many times, but I encourage you to use the animation system that previously known as Mechanim, but it's now part of Unity as a full component. Has been for quite a while now, and it's a very powerful tool to create really nice looking animations and transitions between those states. You can also use the animation state machine to simply, there's no reason that this has to actually be there's no reason this needs to be attached to a motion. You can just use this as maybe for an AI state machine, and have the same kind of access through code to set various parameters on through set bool, set float on your state machine if you wanted to use that for as well. If you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and reach out to me, and I'll do my best to answer those. And I hope this was useful to you.